What if the band that finally hit #1 voted out their own frontman the very next year? 17 years of brotherhood dissolved in a single meeting. Centerfold owned the charts. MTV played them on rotation. Then they fired the voice that sold it all and released one album without him that nobody bought. The man they threw away, he went on to have hits with the very songs they'd rejected. This is the Peter Wolf problem J Geils Band couldn't survive. The story begins not in a recording studio or on a stadium stage, but in the sweaty, smoke-filled rooms of Boston and Worcester, Massachusetts in the late 1960s. This was a city that took its blues seriously. The underground music scene was thriving, fueled by a reverence for authentic African-American musical traditions that most cities had already abandoned in favor of psychedelic experimentation. 3 musicians formed the core of what would eventually become the J Geils Band. Guitarist John J. Geils, bass player Danny Klein, and harmonica wizard Richard Salwitz played together as the J Geils Blues Band, grinding through club dates with an intensity that turned casual listeners into devoted followers. They weren't trying to be British. They weren't chasing Cream or Led Zeppelin. They were chasing Muddy Waters and Little Walter, and they played with the conviction of men who truly understood the music they were playing. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Then, in 1968, everything changed. Peter Wolf arrived. He and drummer Stephen Joe Blad came from a local R&B outfit called the Hallucinations, and Wolf brought something the band didn't know it needed. He was a former art student and a late-night disc jockey, where he'd built a devoted following under the nickname the Woofa Goofa. He knew blues and soul records that most of his contemporaries had never heard. He could recite liner notes from obscure singles like Scripture, and when he stepped in front of a microphone, something electric happened. The band quickly found its home at the Boston Tea Party, a legendary venue on Berkeley Street that served as the nucleus of the city's underground rock scene. Night after night, they refined their sound in front of audiences who demanded authenticity. On one historic evening, they shared a bill with Fleetwood Mac. On another night, April 4th, 1968, Wolf's former group, the Hallucinations, performed at the Tea Party on the very night Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. The music that poured out of that building carried the weight of a country in grief. The band that emerged from those residencies was built on something pure, a we against the world energy born from shared struggle and musical passion. Every man on that stage earned his place through sweat, not salesmanship. They weren't a manufactured product. They were a living, breathing organism, and Peter Wolf was its beating heart. By 1970, the J Geils Band had signed with a record company that was home to the soul and R&B legends they'd grown up worshiping. It should have been the moment everything clicked. But the recording studio proved to be a poor container for what they actually were. Their early albums were solid efforts, honest, tough rock and roll, but they couldn't capture the volcanic energy that made their live shows legendary. The band understood this, and rather than fight the limitation, they leaned into it. In 1972, they recorded Full House, a live album captured at Detroit's Cinderella Ballroom. That choice of city was not accidental. Detroit had become the band's second home, a place where their blue-collar, no-frills ethos resonated with a working-class audience that had little patience for pretense. The factory workers and assembly line men who packed those Detroit venues didn't want sophistication. They wanted truth. And the J Geils Band delivered it in industrial quantities. Full House became the document that defined them. Wolf stalked the stage like a man possessed, part preacher and part comedian, connecting with the audience in ways that most rock singers could only dream of. His jive talking between songs, his street poetry, was as much a part of the performance as any note the band played. The harmonica solos drew comparisons to jazz giants like John Coltrane. J Geils' guitar work was economical and ferocious. Together, they were something rare, a band where every single member mattered. A second live album, Blow Your Face Out, arrived in 1976, and if anything, it doubled down on everything that had made Full House essential. Recorded in both Boston and Detroit, it captured a band at its absolute peak as a performing unit. The shows were legendary. The crowd reactions were visceral. Critics who had dismissed them as a derivative blues act had no choice but to acknowledge what was happening on those stages. But a pattern had already begun to form. In the promotional machinery surrounding the band, one name appeared more frequently than the others. One face dominated the photos and the interviews. Peter Wolf was becoming the story, and the rest of the band was quietly becoming the backdrop. For all their power as a live act, the J Geils Band spent most of the 1970s in a condition that most of their fans never suspected: financial desperation. The contract they had signed in 1970 was, in the words of those who studied it later, draconian. Eager and naive, the band had signed without legal counsel, driven by the excitement of joining a label that represented their musical heroes.
Must've got low. I got low.
The terms were brutal. 10 albums recorded over the course of a decade, and the band saw almost none of the revenue. They were perpetually in debt to the label, which meant that the money from their record sales flowed in the wrong direction before it ever reached them. Their survival depended entirely on the road, on ticket sales and merchandise, on the brute force of a touring machine that never stopped moving. This financial reality had profound consequences for the band's internal dynamics. The desperate need for a commercial breakthrough, for a song that could crack top 40 radio and generate the kind of royalties that would finally erase the debt, empowered a specific vision within the group. Seth Justman, the band's keyboardist, had been quietly developing a talent for writing concise, hook-driven pop songs. And as the 1970s wore on, his voice in the creative process grew louder. The label finally dropped the band in 1978, following the release of Monkey Island, an ambitious, experimental album that critics admired but audiences largely ignored. The dismissal was a blow, but it also opened a door. The band signed with a new recording company, a label that provided both the promotional infrastructure they'd never had and a clear commercial mandate to deliver radio hits. That mandate handed Seth Justman the keys to the kingdom. He was the man who could write what radio wanted. And for a band drowning in debt and desperate for financial stability, his ability to craft a pop song felt less like artistic compromise and more like salvation. The song Comeback, released in 1980, became one of their biggest radio successes to that point. The formula was working. The money was finally coming in. For 5 of the 6 members, that felt like vindication. The blues roots were still there, but they were beginning to feel like a costume rather than a conviction. The distance between Peter Wolf and his bandmates grew in ways that went beyond music. In 1974, Wolf married actress Faye Dunaway, one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. Fresh from her Oscar-winning performance in Network and her iconic role in Chinatown, Dunaway was Hollywood royalty. And suddenly, Peter Wolf was attending the Academy Awards and moving through social circles that his bandmates couldn't access, didn't want to access, and in some cases, quietly resented. This wasn't petty jealousy, it was a structural reality. While Wolf was navigating the worlds of film premieres and celebrity culture, the rest of the band was in the trenches, kicking and scratching for every dollar, grinding through tour schedules, fighting to keep the lights on in the face of an exploitative record contract. The lives they were living were simply different, and over time, different lives create different people. Wolf and Dunaway divorced in 1979 after 5 years of marriage. The experience left its mark on Wolf's songwriting. The 1980 album Love Stinks was written by Peter Wolf and Seth Justman, and while the title track may have been inspired in part by the collapse of Wolf's marriage, that connection is best treated as a reported interpretation rather than a fully proven fact. The title track, dripping with bitter wit and genuine hurt, became one of the band's signature moments. But the album around it signaled that the blues influence of their earlier years was leaving. Love Stinks was primarily shaped by Seth Justman, and it bore his fingerprints unmistakably. The production was tighter and more polished than the band's earlier work, with a cleaner, more radio-friendly feel. Wolf's voice was still soulful, still magnetic, but the musical world it inhabited had fundamentally changed. Wolf began voicing his dissatisfaction, telling interviewers and bandmates alike that the direction felt wrong. He had given 17 years to building something authentic, something rooted in the tradition of the great R&B artists he'd worshipped as a kid. What he was singing over now felt, in his words, like sweet, empty pop. The songs were better crafted for radio, the arrangements were smarter, but somewhere in that polish, the fire was going out. The rest of the band didn't share his diagnosis. To them, the new direction wasn't compromise, it was evolution. And that disagreement cut to the bone. In 1981, the J Geils Band released Freeze Frame, and the world finally noticed them in the way they'd always deserved, and in a way that immediately began to destroy them. Centerfold hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 6 consecutive weeks. Freeze Frame, the album, sat atop the Billboard 200 simultaneously. They appeared on MTV in heavy rotation, and Peter Wolf's manic, rubber-limbed energy made him the perfect physical presence for the music video era. To the casual observer, the J Geils Band had arrived. After 17 years of scratching and fighting, they were finally the biggest rock band in America. This came with a brutal irony that only the people inside the room could fully understand. Freeze Frame was largely Seth Justman's vision. He had written much of the material, shaped the arrangements, and guided the record into its polished, synth-forward form. The pop edge that the public was now celebrating was Justman's direction, not a collective one. And Peter Wolf, the frontman who carried the band's image into the MTV era, was increasingly alienated from the music he was singing. The success also created a visibility imbalance that could not be undone. The audience saw J Geils Band and thought Peter Wolf. The talk shows, the magazine profiles, the MTV interviews, all of them focused on the frontman. The other 5 members, who had given equally of themselves over nearly 2 decades, found themselves reduced to supporting players in a narrative about someone else's stardom. Resentment built quietly behind the platinum record framed on the wall. There was also the pressure of legacy. The band's older audience, the men who had discovered them at the Cinderella Ballroom and the Boston Tea Party, looked at Centerfold and Freeze Frame and felt something had been lost. This wasn't the R&B outfit that had opened their eyes to Muddy Waters and Little Walter. This was something shinier, smoother, and considerably less dangerous. The band had traded its soul for a #1 single. Whether that trade was worth it depended entirely on who you asked. The recording sessions for the follow-up to Freeze Frame in 1983 became the crucible where everything finally broke. Peter Wolf arrived with songs, real songs, written in the tradition of the R&B and roots rock that had defined the band's early identity. He had spent time developing material that felt honest to him, that reflected the emotional and musical journey of the previous decade. He believed in those songs. He thought they represented a path back to something the band had left behind. The rest of the band rejected them. The 5 other members voted to continue in the pop direction that had brought them to #1. Justman's commercial instincts had been validated in the most dramatic way possible, and the group had no appetite for retreating from the formula that had finally delivered financial stability after years of debt. Wolf's material was too rooted, too raw, too far from the polished sound that had saved them. Then came the meeting. Wolf described it later as heartbreaking, which might be the single most understated word in rock and roll history. The 5 men who had shared a stage with him for 17 years sat across from him and told him he was out. Not that the direction was changing, not that they needed to find a compromise. They voted him out of the band he had helped build from a basement in Boston. Wolf was blindsided in a way that went beyond professional betrayal. He had thought of these men as brothers. The J Geils Band had been his life's work, the vehicle through which he had expressed everything he cared about, the music, the performance, the communion with an audience. The sudden, clinical finality of the vote left him unable to perform for several years. The wound wasn't professional, it was personal, in the way that only long, deep bonds can fracture. The band announced the split publicly with minimal drama. There was no last tour meltdown, no screaming match that leaked to the press. Just the quiet, devastating sound of a brotherhood dissolving after a vote. The proof of what they had discarded came quickly and without mercy. In 1984, the remaining members of the J Geils Band released You're Getting Even While I'm Getting Odd, one album without Peter Wolf. Seth Justman stepped into the lead vocal role. He was a brilliant songwriter and producer. He was not Peter Wolf. The record was a commercial disaster, and the reviews were withering. Critics who had celebrated Freeze Frame were now describing the new album as generic, lifeless, and lacking the swagger that had made the band essential. The audience that had made Centerfold a #1 single largely ignored the new release. The band dissolved in 1985. The experiment of replacing the irreplaceable had failed in less than a year. Meanwhile, Peter Wolf released Lights Out in 1984, featuring the very songs the band had rejected. The title track became a substantial hit, and the album was praised precisely for the quality that the band had voted against, its balance of modern production with genuine soul. Wolf followed it in 1987 with Come As You Are, which further solidified his reputation as a roots rock artist of real depth. The contrast between Wolf's solo trajectory and the band's implosion told a story that no one needed to translate. But the tragedy didn't end there. In 2012, the man whose name was on the marquee, J Geils himself, filed suit against his former bandmates for using the band's name on a tour that excluded him. He believed, with reasonable logic, that as the founder and namesake, he had certain rights over the brand. His former partners pointed to a 1982 agreement that gave majority control over the name. The lawsuit was the final rupture. J Geils spent his last years in seclusion, focused on his passion for classic cars, estranged from the men with whom he had created some of the most vital rock and roll of the 1970s. When he died in 2017, the reconciliation that might have healed everything had never come. Today, the J Geils Band occupies a complicated place in the American rock canon. Their legacy split cleanly down the middle, the gritty R&B machine from the early years and the MTV pop powerhouse at the end. Both versions were real. Both versions produced music that mattered, but the division between them was also the fracture that destroyed the band. Success revealed what the struggle had managed to hide, that 6 very different men had been held together by shared need, and once that need was satisfied, the differences had nowhere left to go. The J Geils Band never failed from lack of talent. They failed because too much success arrived too late, after too many years of compromise had done their damage. Peter Wolf was their greatest strength and the problem they couldn't solve. The live recordings still crackle with an energy most bands never find, but the brotherhood that created them is gone. What's your memory of J Geils? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from rock's greatest era.